For those of you who I haven't met yet this weekend, my name's Connor. I'm a fossil fuels campaigner at Friends of the Earth. I've got a history of grassroots activism on fossil fuels, particularly around fracking, dating back to Balcombe many years ago now. And when I was working on fracking at Balcombe, I saw the really important work that Friends of the Earth were doing to support the community there. And Friends of the Earth always stuck out to me as an organisation that was totally prepared to do the hard yards and put in the hard work and support communities on the front line of fossil fuel extraction. And ever since then, I wanted to work for Friends of the Earth, and 2.5 years ago, I managed to get a job, and now I'm working on the fracking campaign, and it's an honour to be able to spend my days working on the issue that I really care about. Okay, so just earlier this morning we heard the fantastic keynote speech from Chissell, who's back with us here for the discussion of this panel. And we're back to talk again about climate change and specifically how we can get on track for 1.5 degrees, that really bold, ambitious target laid down by the Paris Agreement that's going to take a lot of work to get on track for. And this is really is one of the greatest and most urgent challenges facing humanity at the moment. It's so great because of the vast potential impacts that may be coming down the road from climate change for the world's people, particularly those in the global south. And it's urgent because the science is telling us that in order to have any chance of hitting that 1.5 degree temperature rise limit, we need to really have significant action before 2020. So we've got 18 months, people, no pressure. And to be honest, it's sometimes feels like it's enough to make us want to go home, crawl under a duvet, and not come out. And that's fine, and we all need to do that sometimes. But we know that if we are going to have any chance of hitting that target, we are all going to need to come together and put the work in. So today, we're going to be recognising the scale of the challenge of meeting 1.5 degrees, but we're also going to be talking about what's giving us hope and solutions. And we've already heard from Crystal about a whole range of solutions that show that this can be doable as long as we put the work in. So just to get a sense of the room and to give the speakers a bit of an idea and to make sure that we all kind of introspect and get a sense of where we are too, I want to do another check on where the room's at. And this is about how hopeful we're feeling right now about hitting that 1.5 degree target. And so if you're feeling really, really hopeful and you're like, yeah, totally, we've got it in the bag, we're going to do it, I want your hands up in the air. And if you're feeling like hopeless at the moment about the challenge ahead, I want your hands down here. So can everyone give me hands? What's the third option? Yeah. Oh, that's a range, sorry. Yeah, that's a range. So please feel free to go anywhere within that range. And I'd invite the speakers to join in. So how hopeful are we feeling, Base Camp? Okay. Well, hopefully by the end of this session, we're going to build that up a little bit. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce you to the fabulous speakers that we've got for you today. So first of all, you're going to be hearing from Liz Hutchins, who's the Director of Campaigning Impact at Friends of the Earth, England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Liz has been the Director of Campaigning Impact at Friends of the Earth since September 2017. And she joined the organisation in 2008 to be part of the parliamentary team at the time for the groundbreaking Climate Change Act campaign, which we all know the success of. Liz is also the chair of the board of the New Economy Organisers Network, and that's a network of over 1,000 people working to oppose neoliberal economics and for socially, environmentally progressive alternatives. After Liz, we're going to hear from Laurie Vanderberg, who's from Milieu Defensie, that's Friends of the Earth Netherlands. And Laurie is a researcher and campaigner with Milieu Defensie. She's working on a climate court case against Shell, which I hope some of you have heard about, and she'll be talking a bit more about. She previously worked with a development think tank called the Overseas Development Institute as a researcher on climate and energy issues, where she did research on the topic of fossil fuel subsidies. After Laurie, we're going to hear from Asad Rehman, who's the Executive Director of War on Want, and that's the global human rights and anti-poverty charity. He previously led Friends of the Earth's work on international climate and is a key figure in the global climate justice movement, helping to reframe climate as an issue of racial, economic and social justice. And he's been instrumental in campaigning for the need for equity and ambition to prevent a breach of the 1.5 degrees C threshold. So we're going to hear 10-minute speeches from each of those three, and then we're going to have Chissell back for the Q&A and discussion afterwards, who's the Engagement and Operations Manager at Project Drawdown. And if you didn't see Crystal's keynote just before this, Chissell manages engagement and research fellowships at Project Drawdown. And in that role, she connects individuals and organizations who share the goal of reversing global warming through collective impact. Okay, so over to you speakers. I'm going to give you 10 minutes, and I'll give you a 5-minute and a 1-minute warning. And I invite you to, if you'd like, respond to the keynote speech earlier this morning from Project Drawdown, and also, what work is currently going on and needs to go on in order for us to get on track for 1.5. So over to Liz.
Thanks, Connor. As Connor said, I joined Friends of the Earth nearly 10 years ago, and working on the Big Ask campaign for the Climate Change Act was an incredibly inspiring time to join Friends of the Earth, and it was at a real high point in public opinion on climate change. If around 2007-8, if you look at the kind of opinion polls about who cared about climate change, who felt that they were prepared to take action, it really was a moment where there was a lot of pressure on government, and we saw real cross-party political support for action on climate change and for the Climate Change Act. And I was kind of very parliamentary focused, so I was in Westminster a lot talking to politicians from all the political parties, and it really was a time when there was a sense that there was an expectation of the public that political parties would step up and address this challenge. And the Big Ask campaign went from like a seed idea on the fringes to one where, when it was actually voted for, I think there were only 3 MPs who voted against the Act. And that is an expression of the breadth of political support there. Now, nearly 10 years later, we're in a situation where it's actually, I think, much more difficult to implement the transformational shift that we need to see in society to actually achieve the goals in the Climate Change Act. I think that's a much more difficult thing to do than to pass an act of Parliament. And even though this Act of Parliament committed the then government and future successive governments to taking action on climate change, actually when it comes to shifting our energy system, our transport system, we're really facing a power battle in society, and we're having to challenge some incredibly entrenched vested interests that have been, built up since the Industrial Revolution, and the kind of the powers that we're challenging in finding a pathway to decarbonisation are ones that are going to resist us every step of the way. And I think, therefore, what we need to do as a campaigning organisation and as a much wider movement, and we're a very important but one of many actors in this space wanting to get on track for the action needed on climate change, is to see this not just as a technical issue, but very much as a power issue. And I think that the reason, and Connor mentioned that I'm also involved in NEON, and I think that we all need to look at the economic structures of society and the kind of structures of inequality in society, and to systematically challenge those if we're going to be able to achieve the decarbonisation pathway that we need to get onto. And I think we can really see that there are successes in movements that are challenging some of those inequalities around the world. So, in America, we saw people mobilising behind Bernie Sanders because he was presenting a different vision, and a vision that wasn't just about following corporate interests and the establishment. And we've seen that in this country to some extent, and in particularly in Southern Europe as well. And I think what we need to try and achieve is a vision for society about what does this pathway look like? If we're going to really get on track to meeting the Paris Agreement, what does that mean for all of us in our everyday lives? And how can we develop a vision that everybody feels they have a stake in fighting for? I think that's our task. If this is seen as a kind of a technical fix or something that needs to come from, the government, or if it's seen as something that is as kind of small scale as changing a light bulb, as I think Crystal said earlier, it's not something that will be inspiring enough to really take people with us. And the reason I'm kind of emphasising the power piece is that we're kind of facing two sort of twin dynamic problems at the moment. One of them is the extraordinary growth in wealth inequality in the world, and we've seen that particularly accelerated over the last 10 years since the financial crash, and a lot of austerity is about concentrating wealth in the hands of ever fewer people, at the same time as the climate crisis and deepening ecological degradation. And there's some really shocking statistics about how this relates to climate change. The top 10% of emitters living on every continent generate around 45% of global emissions. Imagine that. The top 10% are responsible for 45% of global emissions. And Kate Raworth, who wrote a brilliant book called Donut Economics, Kate spoke at last year's base camp. It's really worth reading that book if you haven't already. She calls them the carbonistas. So these are the people who are really overwhelmingly responsible for the climate crisis that we're in, while the bottom 50% of people contribute only 13% of emissions. And in that, I think in those statistics, I kind of see hope and a challenge. So the hope is that, actually, it's the really richest people in the world, frankly, they could change their consumption habits rather rapidly. And there are things that, and we've seen, the technologies are there. There are lots of things that can happen incredibly rapidly to bring down carbon emissions. But it also means that the majority of humanity really have this huge stake in the benefits. And it's possible, I think, to unite them. I want to say just a little bit more about the UK context and why action by 2020 is both essential but also very challenging. Obviously, I sort of said since the Climate Change Act that I think there's 10 years ago, there's been a real, unfortunately, polarisation in the kind of politics on climate change, and we're seeing really divergent pathways from the government and opposition parties. And the government relatively recently came out with its clean growth strategy, which was its strategy to meet the Climate Change Act targets. And when the Committee on Climate Change, the government's official advisors on climate change, looked at that strategy, they said, it just isn't sufficient to meet even the Climate Change Act targets that we've got now, and that's before they need to be strengthened in line with the Paris Agreement. And Friends of the Earth, we also took that view, and actually we started legal proceedings against the government for the weakness of their strategy. So I think that we're in a kind of a very difficult position where the government doesn't have a plan to even meet the current Climate Change Act targets. They have committed to ask the Committee on Climate Change to tighten the targets in line with the Paris Agreement, and that's why the kind of 2020 date is so important politically, because it's the moment when world leaders will come together again and agree what they call the ratchet, which is to tighten domestic climate targets globally. And so one of the tasks that we have is to put pressure on the UK government when it asks the Committee on Climate Change to ratchet our Climate Change Act target, is to make sure that the level of ambition is commensurate with this 1.5 degrees that we need to stay on track for. That's one of the challenges that we need to address. So I think we've been talking about the strategy for Friends of the Earth's work on climate change, and we're trying to do kind of three things. One is shift our work towards being as propositional as we are oppositional. So we need to be the ones saying what we're for, not just what we're against. We need to have a vision that puts people at the heart of the solutions and shows why our solutions are as good for people as they are for the planet, and they need to be relevant, compelling, credible, and tangible. And we need to engage with people as much with the heart as the hand. And those people who saw the flip chart at the start of yesterday's session will see how important that is. There are some really key moments coming up in the coming year that we need to seize upon to really demonstrate the strength of feeling, and I think that we need to get to the point where we have huge mobilisations of people on this issue, as we did ahead of the Paris climate talks and as we did around the Climate Change Act. Donald Trump's coming to visit, and we're going to make sure that when he does, he gets a reception that actually puts climate change as an issue at the absolute heart of the response to that. We will have this moment when the government is asked to tighten the Climate Change Act targets, and we need to have a real focus on that. In October this year, we're expecting an IPCC report that sets out the IPCC's view that it is possible to keep on track for 1.5 degrees, but only if we have transformational change of our systems, how we heat and power our homes and businesses, how we travel. And so what we want to do is make sure that we've got a vision that's commensurate for that, for our country, and make sure that when at an international level, the IPCC is saying we can stay on track for 1.5 degrees, we're saying how that should happen, and make sure that everybody is involved. And the last thing to say is just the reason that the whole of Basecamp is themed around 1.5 degrees is that the solutions need to be a solution that everybody here is involved in organising for. And one of the reasons that we're all part of an organisation rather than just working individually is because when we join together, we're more powerful. And when you're all doing just incredible, amazing things in your own communities, one of the things that Friends of the Earth as a whole needs to do is to join those up and have a narrative that makes sense of it to the outside world, and to make sure that your examples are showcased and that people around the country see that this alternative path is possible, and it's ordinary people who are going to be able to make it happen.
Thank you very much, Liz. Okay, now over to Laurie from Millie Defensi.
Thank you. So first of all, I'd like to say that I'm extremely excited to be here, not just because of the amazing program, and I would like to thank everyone who has made this possible, this whole Basecamp event. This is my first Basecamp, and it's been amazing so far. I've attended great talks, and I've had many great conversations with people here. I've even gotten some new piece of information that I can use in my court case, in our court case against Shell. And I'm here, of course, to talk about the court case that we're going to file against Shell because of climate change. One of the questions was also to reflect a little bit on the keynote speech that we had just now. That was really great. And I've thought about it a little bit. And although I do agree that we need to continue to research the solutions to climate change, I actually do not think that it's the problem that we don't have the solutions or that governments don't know about it. I think that the real problem is that governments and corporations are refusing to implement the solutions. And this is one of the reasons why we are trying to take on corporate power and trying to get Shell to stop wrecking the climate. Let me see. Yeah, so the theme of this presentation is how do we get on track for 1.5 degrees? And one of the solutions to meeting this huge challenge is to keep fossil fuels in the ground, as I'm sure you're all very aware of. if you look at the carbon that is contained in the global oil and gas and coal reserves that are currently being exploited, so all of those reserves that are already in production, that carbon already will take us far beyond 1.5 degrees. So if you look at what needs to happen to stay below 1.5 degrees, we need to leave the majority, of course, of that carbon in the ground. We need to not invest in opening up new oil and gas reserves, and we need to bring down existing production. This is a really urgent task. And while governments know that this needs to happen and corporations know that this needs to happen, they are not doing it. Instead, we're seeing that corporations like Shell are uniting in trade associations and are taking on the explicit objective of trying to sow doubt about climate change science and about the solutions that can be brought to solve the climate crisis. They are trying to put forward false solutions like a gas as a transition fuel that is going to help us to bring down emissions. They are going to our universities to teach about the energy transition and to make sure that that it is implemented in a very slow pace, and to make sure that they continue to profit by wrecking the climate at the cost of people and planet. And this is why we at Milieudefensie think that it's really time for corporations to take responsibility for climate change. We think that it's illegal to set fire to someone's house, just as it is illegal to burn our common planet. This is why we're going to court and to claim that Shell is breaching its duty of care by continuing to undermine the climate targets. And what we're demanding is that Shell aligns its business model with Paris targets, that it brings down its oil and gas production activities, and that it reduces its emissions to zero by 2050. And what makes me really hopeful is that we're not alone in this fight, because we're seeing that there is a growing global movement of people fighting for climate and social justice, and we're part of that movement, and I feel very much supported by everyone here in this room that is part of that movement. And so we're not the only ones that are suing Shell. So New York is suing Shell, San Francisco is suing Shell, the Philippines Commission on Human Rights is doing an investigation into human rights breaches by Shell and 46 other oil and gas majors because of climate change. So they're really being hit from all different directions. And I was at the Shell AGM last week in The Hague, where I asked Shell whether they would respond to our liability letter, which they said that they did and they would do, and they did last week on Monday, and they basically said, we don't believe that your claims have merit, where these are, by the way, our climate ambitions, which we, of course, had full knowledge about and which we criticized in our liability letter, but they failed to respond to that criticism, of course. So that was a clear signal for us, like, okay, let's go to court, let's make sure that they start acting and meet their legal responsibilities. And what was lovely to see at that AGM is that there were all sorts of people coming together. So in the Netherlands, people in Groningen, in the north of the Netherlands, have been very negatively affected by gas extraction there. It has led to a lot of earthquakes, and people have cracks in their houses and they live in unsafe houses. So they're under a lot of stress. Their houses aren't worth anything anymore and they are still stuck to their mortgages. This is a terrible thing to see. So these people came to The Hague to come up for their rights. There were people in The Hague from Argentina who were fighting Shell because of their new plans to extract shale oil from the Vaca Muerta. There were people in The Hague that are fighting Shell because of corruption in Nigeria. There were people in The Hague that are actually working for Shell as contractors, and that were demanding better working conditions, because Shell is not just ruining our planet and the environment, but it's also not treating its workers well. So it was really inspiring to see all of these different pieces come together there, and to see that we're actually all part of the same fight. And I think that's all I would like to say for now. Thanks.
I did a bit of a depressing talk earlier on this morning, so I'm going to find reasons to be cheerful. I think as Laurie said, the question that's, I think, always facing us is not that we don't know what needs to be done, not that we don't know what the technical solutions are. It's the political will of politicians to act and how we build power to make them act against these powerful vested interests. So the first reason I'm cheerful is we actually have a global movement for climate justice. And I say that's really important because those voices of the global south, which for many years were absent in the climate movement and the climate debate, are now there, and they're making real demands. And they're making demands not only about what needs to be done, they're making demands on movements in the global north about what real solidarity means. And so just last week, Friends of the Earth Manchester was with people we brought over from Colombia, COSPAC, with campaigners from Argentina at BP, together with environmental justice and climate justice campaigners. That was a real step forward. It's about building those global links, about building an intersectional approach also. So for me, that's really important. The fact that we're having collectively this discussion about 1.5, that's a real reason to be cheerful, because for a long time, most major environmental groups didn't want to talk about 1.5. And of course, and I applaud the fact that Friends of the Earth is one of the few that does want to talk about 1.5. I think for a lot of others, it's still simply a paper policy. So that, for me, is really important, because Friends of the Earth, not only here in the UK, but has a global federation. And that's really important, to be able to have this incredible global federation working around preventing a breach of 1.5. The second one, which Liz also alluded to, was about the issue about inequality. And I've always thought, if austerity is, redistribution of wealth from the rich, from the poor to the rich, then climate change is the redistribution of life from the global south to the global north. And so the fact that we've got this increased focus on inequality, the fact that actually more and more people are asking, how come we can live in a world where a handful of men can own as much income as 3.5 billion people? How come last year that 82% of all the wealth that was created in the world went to the top 1%, and the bottom 3.5 billion people received absolutely nothing? And I say that the fact that we're talking about inequality, the fact that the IMF now talks about and says inequality is a result of a broken economic system, the fact that Davos made inequality one of its focuses of its conversations this year, the elite, the people who are most responsible, having to reflect the fact that people are actually talking about and demanding something different. I've been part of the Labour Party's shadow DFID's task force on what Labour's policies should look like if they come to power. And I think one of the reasons I'm cheerful is that Labour have committed to putting a duty on tackling inequality as well as poverty for its international development. That's a huge step forward. I think in the presentation this morning, we talked about food, and we know that, when we talk about climate change, the mantra has always been, you have to change the way we produce and consume energy, you have to change the way we produce and consume food, you have to bring land rights and end deforestation. And food is such an important aspect of that. And of course, the reality is that it's the multinationals who control so much of our food system. They dominate everything from food production to processing to sales. And in India, where Monsanto have attempted to control seeds, and particularly GM seeds, and enforce GM seeds, there's been a food crisis, and millions of farmers have been plunged into debt. And they've calculated that in every 30 minutes, an Indian farmer commits suicide because of those debts. But early this year, there were huge farmers' marches in India. Hundreds of thousands of farmers marched barefoot from the countryside into cities. And actually the whole of the city started to come out, and people started to unite. Students and ordinary people in the cities started to listen and hear the reality of those farmers, and forced Indian politicians to have to give in to the demands of farmers, protect their local agroecology, take action against the multinationals. I find that a real reason to be cheerful for. If you remember, a couple of years ago now, all of us were involved in a campaign against TTIP, you know, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. And I remember the beginning of that, and people said, you'll never mobilize people around trade. You'll never mobilize people around this acronym TTIP. Oh, it's so abstract, people don't care. And actually, millions of people cared, and we defeated TTIP. That's an incredible reason to be cheerful. Of course, there's a long way to go, right? Because at the heart of TTIP was the investor-state dispute settlement. The idea that private corporations, multinationals, would be able to sue governments for policies that would adversely affect their profits. Those are that ISDS, which is at the root cause of preventing everything that we want to take on. Well, there's a campaign to build against it. And again, not here a cheerleader for the Labour Party, but both the Labour Party and the Green Party have committed that they would pause ISDS in all trade agreements. I found that as a reason to be cheerful. And you talked about Trump, you know, well, Trump's coming, right, to this country. I'm also involved in this coalition called Stop Trump. We put 30,000 people on the streets like when Trump enacted his Muslim ban. And what struck me about those 30,000 people was they were not your left people. They were ordinary people who were mobilized, who came out by themselves. And that gives me great hope. Because when I look at our events page for 13th of July when it comes, I see hundreds of thousands of people committed to coming out and opposing Trump. Just saying that they're against not Trump, just Trump, but Trumpism, the policies, the racism, the xenophobia, the idea of building walls and fences, of turning your back on climate change, of shining a lens not only on Donald Trump there, but on this rise of right-wing populism that's sweeping around the world. And I think that gives me hope that actually there can be an alternative to that. And what I'm really lucky. I work for War on Want, and so we work with partners in the global south and in communities on the front line. And I want to tell you about one of those communities. It's in Colombia. Now, Anglo Gold Ashanti, which is the third biggest mining company in the world, it struck gold. It said it was the biggest gold find that had been anywhere. And they named it the Colossus. And this is not just any company. Private Eye in 2011 called Anglo Ashanti the most evil company in the world because of its environmental and human rights violations that it committed in Ghana. But what I found really inspiring was local people in that village in Cajamarca resisted that gold mine. And I would just want to say, this is what one of the women, and it was overwhelmingly women, who led the resistance. And I can, again, that always gives me more hope and gives me hope. She said this fight against this mine wasn't a fight against a mine. It was actually a fight for the defense of land, of water, of nature, for human rights and for human dignity. And they united the local people in an incredible campaign against the local state, against the national state, and against the power of this multinational, who were offering people everything from bribes and etc. And also from the effect of paramilitaries. Paramilitaries killed leaders of that local campaign. Now, and this is in a country where 105 human rights defenders have been killed for resisting extractivism. And the government called a popular referendum, suddenly hoping to catch people off ground. 97% of people voted against the mine. And this year has been the 10th anniversary of that resistance. And not only that, but 9 other municipalities in Colombia have had popular referendums where they voted against extractivism. And another 54 are now considering a popular referendum. Just close by in El Salvador, one of the poorest countries in the world, there has been a national referendum where the whole country voted to end all extractivism, where a country said, this is not the model of development that we want. We want an alternative model of development that doesn't rely on extractivism. That, again, gives me absolutely incredible hope. And I think this conversation about what is our economy and what's it for, I think that also gives me a lot of hope. And I'm going to now mention, because I'm from Burnley and I'm always proud of Burnley, that, you know, last year we celebrated 40 years of the Lucas Aerospace Plan. And a Lucas plan, and I'm sure some of you probably know about, you know, Lucas Aerospace, the armaments factories in Lancashire who were facing closure, and the workers and the shop stewards came up with an alternative plan. 40 years ago, came up with an alternative plan to switch production from the arms industry to socially productive and useful things. And what were they suggesting they made? Said kidney dialysis machines and wind turbines 40 years ago. Now, that plan never came to fruition, but the fact that last year the TUC passed its first ever motion on climate change gave me a lot of hope. The fact that actually now people are talking about justice transition, they're talking about how do you switch an economy, because the reality is we can't simply bring renewable energy to a fossil fuel-based economy. We have to have an alternative and transform that economy. But that does mean workers have to be at the centre of that. The fact that justice transition is now becoming part and parcel of the language of our movement, I think that gives me real hope. And it gives me real hope because people are actually challenging the logic of neoliberalism. They're challenging the logic that says we all have to work longer and harder for less and less pay. They're challenging the logic that says that growth is possible infinitely on a finite planet. And the fact that in the North we have to start talking about what does degrowth look like, what does our economy of the future, what does our society of the future look like, all of those give me hope.
Thank you very much, Asad. And can we keep the round of applause going for all of our speakers? Okay, great. So we've got half an hour left of the session, and we're going to open it up for discussion now. I'm going to be inviting questions for our speakers from the audience, but also contributions of what you're doing, what work you're doing in your communities on climate. Oh, okay, cool. I'm going to give you a minute just to think about those while I ask a couple of questions to the panel. So think about questions for the panel and also things that you're working on that you'd like to share to try and build that feeling of hope. So leading on from Asad's great speech, I want to talk about hope and not complacency. We understand the vast scale of the challenge that's ahead of us. But Asad talked about lots of things around the world that are making him hopeful at the moment. And I just wanted to ask the other speakers to share something in their work or outside of their work, either in the UK, the US, the Netherlands, or around the world, that is making them feel hope. And also, when we talk about climate change and we realise the vast scale of the solutions that are needed, it can often feel overwhelming and difficult for people to get involved with. So what things can people be doing either to advocate for the change that we need or to work towards kind of practical and the prefigurative interventions that we heard about yesterday in their communities to be part of this climate solution? So who'd like to go first? Laurie?
Yeah. Do I need to stand up or just... No, okay. So what really makes me hopeful is that, as I said already during my speech, is that we're really part of a growing global movement of people coming up for climate and social justice. And here in the UK, we've also received a huge amount of support for our case. We've had 13,000 people joining our case as honorary co-claimants, and that is then immediately also a thing that you can do if you want to support our case. You can sign up as an honorary co-claimant and support our case by doing that. And in the Netherlands, we're at 11,000 co-claimants, and they will actually also go to court with us. And many of those co-claimants have said that they wanted to do more to support our case. So they are now going around the country to organize information evenings at community centers, at universities, to talk about climate change, about the need to keep fossil fuels in the ground and what you can do to help solve the climate crisis. So that I think is really inspiring and gives me a lot of hope. And what also gives me a lot of hope is that there are more and more people who are refusing to accept injustice and who are realizing that they can do something to stop that and taking action and becoming active. So yeah, that's it for me.
So what makes me optimistic in relation to Project Drawdown's work is what we're seeing, the uptake that we're seeing of the work. So although this is a room full of campaigners who are very aware of the issue, you are already taking action, there's vast parts of the population, at least in the United States, where global warming is not on their radar. They're not necessarily implementing solutions. They don't necessarily already know what the solutions are. And so we're seeing a lot of response from teachers who are teaching Drawdown in their classes, developing curriculum around Drawdown. We see people from all sectors of society wanting to know more. People are very responsive to seeing the full range of solutions and seeing that there is actual calculation of the impact. So I think, as well as our message, so the message that's more focused on solution and on the range of solutions for people who are not necessarily wanting to campaign, but who want to do something in their own homes. It's very empowering to them. So I think that we have the opportunity to reach a lot more people, not just those who are already involved in campaigning, but a much broader part of the population, which is really important in the developed countries because we're having the most negative impact. So bringing possible actions to a broader range of people is really important.
Yeah, to build on that, I think what gives me hope is the diversity of our movement. And the first day of work for me at Friends of the Earth, I went to we used to have like a conference in a conference centre, and all of the speakers were white men, and the only role that women had was announcing when lunch was going to be and the facilities arrangements, and actually just people said this isn't okay, and the environment movement had become very isolated from other progressive struggles in society. And if you just look at this base camp this weekend, it's just absolutely like the inverse of that. In every single session we've seen a celebration of ethnic diversity, women, all ages, and I think it's only when our struggle for kind of environmental sustainability is understood as a struggle for the well-being of people here and around the planet, and that the movements for change are connected together, that we're really going to see the scale of impact that's needed. And we have seen, Asad was saying about, we're part of an international federation. There are extraordinarily inspiring examples like the Keystone Pipeline and the role of Indigenous people in opposing that. In this country, we see community energy schemes that are in, housing estates in some of the poorest parts of our country. If you look at kind of youth and the kind of the views that young people have overwhelmingly on climate change, incredibly passionate. And I think that's what gives me hope. It's the kind of bringing struggles together and the diversity and the kind of our strength in our diversity that is really inspiring.
Do you want to come in on what people how people can get engaged, or should we go out to the audience? Okay. All right. So questions and contributions from the audience. I'm going to take them in stacks of 3. So if I can just see hands for now. And we've got 2 mic runners to bring you a mic. Here in the pink top. I'm going to try and spread them around a bit. The green jumper over there. And you in the jacket over there.
I just wanted to know, I was listening to Asad this morning and about giving voice to people in the Global South. Do you feel it's a positive initiative that Fiji was presiding over COP 23 and with the introduction of Talanoa dialogue, do you feel that's going to make a difference to people from the Global South getting their case heard?
Thank you.
Hello. Oh, yeah, brilliant. Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much. Really inspiring talks. So I've got a question for the audience and a question for the panel. The audience question is, if there was an action that took 3 minutes that we could each take that would help us address climate change and would address plastic pollution, would we take it? So if there's an action that took 3 minutes, okay, brilliant. So the action is to switch our energy supply. I've got hope because in this country we've got the option of really, really ethical energy suppliers, but most people don't know it. And if most of us here are already with an ethical energy supplier, think how many friends we've got that don't know they've got that option. So we're about to launch a campaign called Switch from Fossils. And my question, so it's about mobilising that, get a national movement around this, because everyone can do something. It's the 3-minute action to switch your energy supply, and it will make a big difference. So my question to the panel is, would you help us promote this when we're ready to launch? Would you help just share the tweet, as well as switching yourself? So thank you.
So I'm going to strike the more pessimistic tone, I think. My training is as an Earth system scientist. I've worked up in the Arctic looking at carbon cycles and the budgets up there. And when Paris set on the 1.5 degree target, I think myself and many of my colleagues scratched our heads and thought, where's this come from? Because I've subsequently, spoken and polled my colleagues and other climate scientists and Earth system scientists, and not one of the people I've spoken to off the record has said that they think that we can meet a 1.5 degree target. And that's not a political reality. That from their point of view, is a physical Earth system reality. And so, what I guess I'm saying, I'm quite concerned to see that we're putting our efforts so hard on meeting this target as a campaign organisation, which to all intents and purposes might not be even possible to meet. And instead, an alternative target such as trying to reach zero carbon emissions as soon as possible might be a more realistic and actually more genuine target to meet. And I just wanted to know what the panel's view on that is. And also, if we are going to go over 1.5 degrees, what is it then that we should be doing in order to create that just, for the people who are going to be suffering because of missing that target? What do we need to do?
Thank you very much. Just very briefly on the switching energy suppliers question, if anybody is switching energy suppliers, Friends of the Earth does have a partnership with Ecotricity, and if you switch through Friends of the Earth, Friends of the Earth gets some money donated to them from Ecotricity for that. So just Google Friends of the Earth and Ecotricity if you're interested. So 3 questions. One for Asad around Fiji and COP23 and that process. One around should we be promoting switching energy suppliers, and where has the 1.5 degree target come from? Is it possible? Is that what we should be aiming for? Who would like to start? Yes.
I think it's a good question around 1.5, and it's a debate we've had internally, and we've talked to climate scientists like Kevin Anderson from the Tyndall Centre, and there's no doubt that there are emissions in the atmosphere that will continue to warm the atmosphere, even if we stopped all emissions right now. And it's an incredibly tight goal. The reason that we want to keep, but there are mixed views, and there are certainly views that it is possible to keep on track for 1.5 degrees. And as I understand it, that's what the IPCC will be saying in October. The problem with talking about zero carbon, and it's often the phrase net zero carbon is used, is that around the world after Paris, many governments have developed carbon reduction plans based on this idea of net zero, which really means they're planning to overshoot carbon emissions and then use geoengineering approaches to get back on track. And these geoengineering approaches are, they just do not exist in a tested form that can, with any confidence, give us the expectation that we can kind of sequester carbon back into, and you'll know about this in some detail. So we've decided not to focus on a kind of net zero target because we think that there is it's intrinsically dangerous to allow a level of comfort that isn't supported by the technology. We think that the best way to limit carbon emissions is to have an incredibly tight goal. Even if we can't keep on track for 1.5 degrees, the best way to not exceed 2 degrees is to try to keep on track for 1.5 degrees. And as it stands, as the global leaders walked away from Paris, what was on the table in terms of commitments for emissions reduction was more like 3 or 4 degrees, and in some estimations even higher than that. And the other reason, just to link it to 1.5 degrees, is it just does bring it home, the impact that we're already seeing of 1 degree, and the kind of it feels like we can't let humanity off the hook and say that 2 degrees is in any way acceptable. So it's a judgment call. It is quite likely that when Friends of the Earth does campaigning over the next couple of years on climate change, we may not be talking about 1.5 degrees in all scenarios to all people. Frankly, a number like that doesn't mean much to many people. We'll probably be talking a lot about the activities that people can do to get involved in the solutions. But I do think we need to be anchored to something that has absolutely, it needs to have scientific credibility, and I think it's not completely ruled out, but it also needs to have some kind of moral credibility for us.
Project Drawdown's position is that the goal should be reversing global warming or reaching drawdown. So I don't know what the rest of the... I agree that the number goals, the 1.5, the 2 degrees are pretty much meaningless to most people, and we need the most optimistic goal possible. The whole point of Project Drawdown, the reason it was founded was to determine if it's possible to actually reach drawdown, or is it possible to reverse global warming. And so we have a continuing research project and aimed at involving more and more researchers around the world, universities and research institutions, to continue research on whether it's possible to reverse global warming and what are the best means. And then combined with that is our goal of giving a message that this is the most inspiring goal and the only goal that makes sense. And so that's our position.
So let me also say something about the 1.5, because I very much agree with Liz. It's, I mean, when it was demanded, and it has historically been demanded by global movements in the South, it was not only done from a scientific point of view. It was done from a very moral and political point of view. It was to say to, particularly to the global North, the idea that you can keep polluting on your 50-50 chance of being well below 2 degrees and not realizing what the impact and that means for people in the global South, we're not going to let you do that. We're going to put this line in the sand and say there is a consequence. If there's a consequence at 1 degree, there is a huge consequence at 1.5. There is a big debate amongst climate justice people about, what does holding on to 1.5 degree mean? And I've always rationalized it in my head as saying, everything we do, every 0.01% we keep it below, we are saving people's lives. And that's our moral responsibility. And so we have to stick with this as a moral and political line. Because in reality, losing 1.5, it's not losing 1.5. What we will lose is 2, 2.5, and up to 3. So I think it is that kind of position, and why it's really important that we say it. look, the IPCC is going to come out with a report in October. We already know it's going to be terrible. It's going to have terrible projections in it in terms of how to meet the 1.5. It's going to say you'll need all sorts of negative emissions technology. Most of the modelling talks already about that kind of technology. One of the ones, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. And just the land that's needed would be 6 times the amount of land that's currently being used for food production. I mean, the choices that people think are acceptable here in terms of from a science perspective, and what that actually means in terms of in the real world, is why we have to be talking about 1.5 not as a scientific issue, but as a political and moral issue. In terms of Fiji and in the chair of the COP, obviously this COP coming this year will be in Poland and in Katowice in the coal mining area, and Poland will chair the COP. I have to say, having been at a number of COPs over the years, it sort of doesn't really matter who's in the chair, because actually the climate negotiations, because they're actually a negotiation about power and who has power and who doesn't, the real question we have to ask ourselves is, how are we not able to affect the climate talks? If suddenly just turning up at the climate talks every year, it's just not, that's not realistic. You're not going to be able to shift government's positions. It requires a sustained campaign of advocacy and campaigning at a national level. Advocacy at the climate talks by itself, I think, is largely irrelevant, because governments already come with decisions that bid. And the reality is this year, 2018, we're meant to have the facilitative dialogue. This was written into the Paris Agreement. It was when governments would reflect and say, oh, let's look at what was in the Paris Agreement in terms of the pledges. And all the negotiations and all the conversations that are happening at the moment are the same conversations that happened just before Paris. Rich countries are saying, well, those pledges we put in there are just our pledges. We're not doing anything more. We don't want to have any conversation about finance. We don't want to talk about adaptation, and we don't want to talk about loss and damage. And developing poorer countries are saying, hold on a minute, you're not even doing your mitigation. You're not even keeping your pledges there. What are you offering us in terms of adaptation? There's nothing on the table in terms of climate finance, etc. Once this year goes as a facilitated dialogue, there is nothing, no other trigger in the climate negotiations till 2023, when there will be a global stocktake. By 2023, then we are talking about the end of 1.5 and end of 2 degrees. So why actually these climate negotiations, the ones taking place this year, are probably more important than the ones that actually took place in Paris, and in terms of what the kind of pressure that's needed to deliver. So yes, while Fiji, you know, it was always great to have a country of the global south in the chair, the reality of the power dynamics are exactly the same. Powerful northern countries, powerful delegations, poorer developing countries, and their interests being sidelined.
Yeah, I don't really have that much to add to what Liz and Asad have already been saying about 1.5, because of course I'm also part of the Friends of the Earth Federation, so we have the similar position. On switching to renewable energy, of course, happy to promote your campaign. I've also, of course, made the switch to renewable energy, and I encourage everyone to do so as well. I'm based in the Netherlands, but I'll do my best to help you promote your campaign. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to go out for another stack now, and I'll just ask the speakers to be quite brief in their responses, because we're running a little bit short on time. In the red here, over in the blue shirts, and yeah, at the back in the check shirt.
Yeah, just wanted to comment very briefly on 2 things. First of all, on the issue of switching energy suppliers, I'm all for doing that, but I don't think on its own a few individuals switching their energy suppliers is going to address the urgency of the issue. And ultimately, I want to see a situation where we're not asking people to choose between different suppliers in a profit-driven market, but whereby we actually take over the energy supply, and all we offer people is sustainable and energy supply. So what I want to see us do is actually take over the energy industry and actually offer sustainable energy to people, not just encourage people to shop around in the marketplace. The other thing on geoengineering, I mean, I fully agree with people's rejection of geoengineering in general, because I think it's A, unproven, and B, dangerous, and in many ways just an excuse to try and continue with business as usual. But I do think Project Drawdown does demonstrate one exception to that, and that is there is scope to take carbon out of the atmosphere, not through some of these fancy projects like sequestering carbon by sucking it out of the atmosphere and pumping it into the ground and so on, but actually by things like changing farming practices, reforestation and things like that. And I think that is one thing positive that we probably ought to be actually pushing more to people as something that is actually very positive.
Thank you.
Hello? The power and buying of the media will have a huge benefit. And if you look at the success of David Attenborough talking about plastics, people listen. So what are scientists and action groups throughout the world doing to reach the worldwide audience about this 1.5 target?
Hi there. First of all, again, thanks again for the amazing talks and inspiring stories you've been telling us. One of the things we've been working on in Greater Manchester is a community energy scheme, which has been really exciting for us, really hard work as well, but all worth it. In 2016, we installed panels on 3 schools and a community building. We're right now, actually on Tuesday last week, we launched a share offer to raise £145,000 to install solar panels on 4 more primary schools. Some of those schools are in the most deprived areas in Greater Manchester as well, in places like Salford, Little Hulton and Odsall. Thank you. I'm really buzzing right now because I've just checked my phone and actually we've raised £50,000 in the first 4 days. So, and so if anyone wants to help us get that even higher, then you're very welcome to invest. If you want to hear more, Kate's going to be speaking at 3 o'clock in a workshop, in a big workshop tent. So I'll stop there about that. Question for Chris Lathing. Really interested to hear about all the amazing solutions that are out there. In Greater Manchester, we've got the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research to look at what our carbon budget should be for Greater Manchester. What they said is that effectively we need to be carbon neutral by 2038, and actually the next 5 years are critical. We have to halve our emissions in the next 5 years to play our fair share, and that means something like 15% year-on-year reductions. So what I'm really interested to hear is from the solutions you've investigated, what do you think are the things that can be done really quickly at scale to deliver that kind of reduction in an urban environment in a developed country? Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, I'm going to ask you to be brief with your responses. I'm going to go to Crystal first for a response to that question, and then to the other speakers if you'd like to come back on community energy schemes, taking over the energy industry, and what people are doing to reach a global audience on the 1.5 degrees target.
So Project Drawdown's initial research was on a global systems model because that is what we could do in a 2-year time period. So now that our book is published and word has gotten out, we are forming partnerships with other research institutions and universities. So far, 24 are interested in expanding our research, taking on our model, and adapting it so that it can be used in regional and local municipal levels to answer exactly that question. So we also have a plan to develop a online research platform that anyone will be able to use, input data to, and apply our modeling to various contextual boundaries like localities, and because obviously all of the solutions are not, the impact of them varies from place to place. So that's what we have on board, on the horizon for our continuing research. I also wanted to make a comment about the types of solutions that are included. So solutions that are not regenerative or have more negative impacts than positive, with the exception of about 3, which we call bridge technologies. They're included until they are phased out. We haven't included things like BECCS and carbon capture and storage, because they're not actually proven. And one of the other surprising results of our research is that biofuels was found to not actually have an emissions reduction impact, so that wasn't included. So I think that what we'll see as our research continues is we'll see new solutions coming on board online with greater impact, and all of the rankings will shift. People will be able to apply it locally. And so there's a lot of potential for this information and how it can be used. One other thing I wanted to say about the message, that someone asked something about how to get this word out. A major production company in the U.S. is now in the planning stages to do a Netflix series about Drawdown and about solutions in an engaging way to bring the message to more people. So.
Growing movement all around the world wants to see energy as a social good. I think it's critical. Without seeing energy as a social good, we can't make the changes we need. And I think it's really heartening to see the municipalization of energy that's taking place all around Europe, and people standing up against privatization of energy systems, both in the global south. So absolutely. I think the question about scientists is always really interesting. And we've had a lot of conversations with scientists about this, with climate scientists, because there's always been this body of, well, we just do technical, we don't do political, and we don't want to speak. But actually we do need climate scientists speak, but they have to be the right climate scientists. And there are increasingly political voices coming from climate scientists. Stockholm Environment Institute, who did the work with Friends of the Earth on the Fair Shares project, Kevin Anderson and everybody at the Tyndall Centre, there are more and more climate scientists who say it is not possible to talk purely from a technical point of view. We have to be out there. We have to be challenging the narrative and the frames being pushed by other people. So that's absolutely key. I think one final thing I just want to say in terms of technologies. See, a lot of technologies, and I mean, even in our own solutions there about, solar panels and wind turbines, they have, of course, huge environmental impacts on people in the global south, because it still rely on huge levels of extractivism, on rare earth minerals, on extractivism. So what's important for us is to always remember that technology solutions by themselves are not the solution in itself. We have to be always consider what impact it has on people in terms of on the global south. Exactly like lithium, huge conflicts in Argentina and other places around lithium and absolutely.
Yeah, maybe I can say a few words on how we get the word out to the media, and not just on 1.5, but maybe in a particular context of our court case. It appears that media love court cases because it's, and especially big court cases, whether it's against governments or corporations. So we've received a lot of media attention for our case, which has been really helpful. I think that one of the ways in which we're trying to keep this media attention is try to get people who are involved in the case to also write opinion op-eds and send them to the national newspapers, to also produce their own materials that they put out there in the world. And that is one of the ways that we're trying to make sure that people stay up to date on what's happening on our case, and that the world learns about it and also learns about what the issues are that are at stake in this case. Yeah.
Very quickly, the question about switching, absolutely. And Friends of the Earth led the campaign for the feed-in tariff, which is about giving cash back to people for generating their own renewable energy. And that's one of the things that has contributed to a shift in the economics of energy, meaning that renewable energy is, price competitive with increasingly price competitive with fossil fuels. And I think the shift in the economics of energy helps create the space for a shift in the ownership of energy. And as Asad said, it's very inspiring to see not just community energy, but actually kind of local authorities being generators as well as shifting ourselves as consumers. And absolutely that's necessary. on the power of the media, I think that's really interesting, and actually, I think there are just lots of things going on. There's almost the democratization of the media through social media that we all need to be experts in using and setting the agenda. And one of the things that we want to achieve at Basecamp is to make sure we hear about all of your stories, because you should be the story, and what you're doing in your local community should be the story. And the reason that we have an organisation is that we can bring those stories together and amplify them and get them out and make them the things that set the agenda and challenge actually the kind of agenda of the mainstream media. I just wanted to end on just saying about how also we kind of make some of our struggles newsworthy. And I think when Donald Trump does come to the UK, there will be wall-to-wall media coverage. And what we want that coverage to say is that we reject Donald Trump's politics. And if the government hears, and if the media hears, that actually climate change is one of the things that people are most agitated about and most rejecting about Donald Trump, actually that in and of itself will send a signal to government and to the media corporations that they need to actually be reflecting a little bit more about the public will and understand that the government actually is behind public opinion on this, and that's how we kind of set the media agenda.
Okay, so we are just about out of time, but before everyone goes away, I just want to check in again about how positive and hopeful we're feeling. At the beginning of the session, we weren't maybe feeling that positive, so let's see if that's changed. So can everyone again put themselves on a spectrum from like feeling really hopeful about the challenge ahead and feeling completely hopeless about the challenge ahead, somewhere on that range? That is a significant shift. I think that's a sensible level of hope. Okay, I've got two really quick announcements. One is that straight after this session, there's going to be a shared lunch on the site. So this is really about everyone getting food to bring together and share and meet each other and talk over some food. So I think that's happening just over there. So do join in that. And then also the recycling organisation that is here at Basecamp this year are asking for any donations of goods that you can give that they can arrange to be recycled or reused. They're also just over here. Go and speak to them, and I think donations for that finish at 5 p.m. today. So all that's left to do is just, can we have a massive round of applause from the contributions from the audience? And a huge round of applause and thank you for our wonderful speakers. Okay, great. Do you have one update, and then we'll let you go?
I had another legal action that's being taken. Has anyone heard of Plan B Earth? A few. Well, Plan B Earth are taking the government to court over their inaction on climate change. We were in the Royal Courts of Justice in March, and the judge basically said that the time that had been allocated wasn't anywhere near sufficient, and so we're going back to court on the 4th of July, and you're welcome to join us. We'll be campaigning outside the courtroom, and then you'll be able to sit in the courtroom if there's space to actually watch the proceedings. Before that happens, there is an event on the 16th of June where you can find out more about this, and that is at SOAS University in London. If you search Plan B Earth on Facebook, you'll find all the details.